rent control has been very, very bad. One of the major reasons why we're in this situation where your two largest cities have the highest rents in the country, it is not coincidental that both of those are rent controlled provinces.
Welcome to the Tom Storey Show with Steve Karrasch and Tom Storey, where we discuss everything real estate or whatever else is on our minds.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Tom Storey Show, your weekly real estate roundup podcast. Thank you for being here with us today. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and like this video. If you're listening on the audio platforms, Steve, we would appreciate more. Is it Apple Podcast reviews we're looking for? Is that what we're looking for?
Yeah, review us on Apple, even though our Spotify is the one that's taking off right now. So
it is taking off.
Subscribe on YouTube. Apple's kind of like, you know, maybe if there was another real estate podcast, they can have Apple. We'll just take Spotify and YouTube.
All right, fair enough. Today's guest is Max Steinman. He is the CEO of Rentals.ca and the parent company RentSync. We also happen to go to the same high school. Look at us, two public school kids talking about real estate on a podcast. We've made it, man. We've done it. This is it. We're making Northern proud.
That's awesome. Northern alum.
Welcome to the show. So Rentals.ca, I think, is a brand a lot of people know, but could you break down your role, RentSync, just like what's all happening?
Yeah, for sure. Rentals.ca is sort of our headliner brand that a lot of call it consumers would know. It's a coast-to-coast listing site for rental homes. We like to think of it as the top marketplace for rental homes in the country, but it is part of a network of sites. So there's some more regional sites within that network, including Rent Faster out in the West Coast, and also Louis.ca on the East Coast in Quebec. The parent company RentSync started as more of a B2B software business meant for large-scale enterprise multifamily landlords. Mm-hmm. And then we sort of forayed into the listing site business with some acquisitions, including Rentals.ca. And
you guys are in BC as well?
Yeah, coast to coast. And rent. I mean, in each marketplace, there are nuances as to which sites renters prefer more. Rent Faster is a pretty big brand out in British Columbia as well. Yeah.
Because I know, like in Steve's market, and I think Steve, most of BC realtors don't do rentals, right?
Yeah, it's a different license. There's like a property management style license where you can deal with tenancies, and then there's a trading license. And generally speaking, if you're doing rentals in my market anyway, in Surrey in the Fraser Valley, it's direct to landlord most of the time, unless there's the occasional high rise that might have some sort of property manager, but generally speaking, you're direct to landlord.
So for you guys, Max, on Rentals.ca, I guess most of it's direct to landlord, put your listing up on our site type of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Really, there's sort of two categories of landlords. There's the mom and pop style landlords who maybe they own, 1 to 10 units, and they can post for free if they want on any of our sites. But they also can upgrade if they want additional exposure. And then there's the large scale kind of REITs, enterprise level, 100 unit plus type landlords, and they can also post, but it goes through a slightly different channel, actually the RentSync channel, as sort of a posting conduit.
So all these purpose-built rentals popping up everywhere, are they have their own internal, or they're posting on your site?
Yeah, so they'll pretty much all post on our network of sites.
Right.
And they do, we don't do any renting ourselves. We're not agents. We're not an agency. But they have their own leasing teams.
Gotcha.
Sometimes that's as casual as like a superintendent who lives in the building, or a property manager. But lately that's professionalizing a lot more to on-site leasing teams, especially with larger scale projects. And these are not necessarily realtors. They're just staff trained to lease units. Yeah.
And you guys put out some of the best reports. That's how we I didn't even realize, like, obviously we've known each other for a long time. I didn't even realize you were rentals.ca. I knew you were in the space, but I didn't know. And you sent me a message. You're like, thanks for using our report. Like, your rental reports are awesome. So kudos on those. And those come out every month for all across Canada.
Yeah, it's definitely something we've sort of become very known for in the realtor community, but also just in the industry in general, and the media. Like, we have just such a far reach with how it's being picked up by Canadian media. Usually, we kind of track it, but over like 300, 400 media mentions per quarter, like major core media mentions. So yeah, it comes out within the first 10 days of every month, and we're really tracking the rental trends in terms of pricing and how they're changing on asking rents across the country, tracking the top cities and CMAs in the country, and yeah, just making that data more available for really anybody.
I think they're great. It was actually funny. The last time I did CP24, they literally were just asking me questions about your report. Like, you could probably ask him if you want. And you guys teamed up with Urban Nation as well. You guys do things together.
Yeah. So like we have so much data. We're super data rich, but Urban Nation is an incredible company that has just such a good reputation as both sort of economists and data analysts. And we felt that in order to give our report sort of more oomph and just more validity, a partnership there made a lot of sense for us, and they've really helped us elevate that report to the level it's at now. And I think that's partly why it's kind of like the de facto go-to media report that's used, and hopefully kind of why you trust it and use it as well, right?
Well, I've seen Sean speak numerous times at our company, and whenever Sean comes and does a presentation from Urban Nation, I'm like, I have YouTube video ideas for 3 months now, because he gives me all the charts and all the, it's just like, it sounds lame. Like, that's what I get excited about these days. Like, oh, this chart looks pretty good. Okay, so let's get to rental prices, right? So like, we were talking about this just before we started recording, but like, me and Steve, like, Steve, would you say it's fair to say we are an ownership focused podcast? Like, we think home ownership is a good thing, and that if you can get into it, you should try to get into it. Is that like a fair way to put what our conversations are?
Yeah, I would say that I believe, and I like to share my belief very much, that for most people, if they want to be stable in their later years, they should focus on owning a home. That should be the goal, in my estimation.
But we also know that there are a lot of people that watch this, listen to this, that do not currently own their home, and maybe for whatever circumstance they are renting or going to continue to rent. Stop shaking your head. They're going to do it. So what do they need to know, Max, about the rental market? Like, pre-pandemic rents were high, then they got silly. Now they've kind of come down a bit. The last report you guys put out kind of showed that things might actually be decreasing in most of the major markets. What do the viewers of this that are currently renting need to know about the trends in the rental market?
Yeah, it is quite nuanced, but you pointed out some trends right there. The city of Toronto and Vancouver, which have historically been the highest rates for rental in the country, have shown softness in really now more than half a year, where we're seeing year over year just slight declines in average asking rents. And, that doesn't necessarily make them affordable,
right?
Because we're still talking about just like excessive rent to income ratios. But it is interesting. It feels like maybe we've hit a bit of a wall in the rental industry in those cities, in terms of just rents can't go any further. People just cannot afford for those rents to go further. And I think we're also seeing some demographic trends and shifts in consumer demand for those large cities where affordability is sort of in crisis. I actually saw a report this morning. Royal LePage report that it was a survey that showed 50% of people who live in Canada's largest cities would move if they could. So I think that's also playing into why rents are declining in those two cities. At the same time, overall in the country, rents are up year over year. I think the exact figure is 9.3%, which is actually up from last month, which was 8.8. So it's actually kind of re-accelerating. And I think what you're just seeing is sort of a balancing out between markets. Markets like Calgary and Edmonton have been hot, like really, really hot. And so rents have been going up in the teens now, month over month or year over year for several months in a row. But still, the overall affordability is way below, in terms of pricing, way below Toronto and Vancouver.
Tell me if I'm on to something here. Rents go lower in Toronto, Vancouver because those people just move to Alberta. So they're just moving the money. Like, did anything really change, or did they just move there, so it came off a little bit here and went up there? That's basically what's happening, right?
I think that's basically what's happening. Like, interprovincial migration numbers back that up, which is that people are moving from Ontario and to Alberta. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's definitely part of it. I think just the freedom as well, that, you know, the post-pandemic freedom in terms of potentially just working remote jobs is enabling that a little bit as well, where you don't necessarily need to live in Toronto to have a job that might be centered out of Toronto,
right,
or maybe just centered out of wherever.
Yeah.
Right? So it's giving a portion of the market that freedom.
The data that you're collecting, is that, like, for instance, I'm sure you can see if listings are staying on your site longer. And then when you say rent prices, are you like the rest of us where we're kind of seeing what the asking price is, or is there a reporting system where you can actually see what they rent for? Because that's always the argument is always, well, rents are here, but that's usually just today's asking prices and not actually what people are paying for rent, because there's people that have been in for a long period of time. And then there's also, just like selling your home, there's landlords that are going to ask way too much and not get it, and then they're going to get offers that are lower. So do you have like a reporting mechanism to find out what they were actually rented for?
So we do validate against a few different software systems to basically ensure that our rents are in line or are slightly decreased based on what that delta typically is. We don't get to see the leases come through our system, but we make that adjustment to our numbers, you know, for that factor. It's really minimal still. Like, what the asking rents that go up, like, this is still a landlord's market in the sense that most markets, there's not a ton of negotiation going on. You know, the asking rent will come down in the advertisement typically to a point where they then get a tenant. We still haven't shifted, and I don't foresee us shifting anytime soon to a market where, you know, rents get posted in Toronto, 1 bedroom, 2,800, and then somebody's getting in there and going, well, how about I give you 2,450? Like, it's not really happening right now.
But the reason I asked that is, like, I just recently rented out my basement apartment, and when I did that, before the tenants were moving, because they served notice, I put out an ad for like sky high, right? Like, maybe it'll get
greedy ass landlord. Posted on Craigslist or something weird. Should have posted on rentals.ca.
Test the market. And then eventually, when I ended up, you know, actually wanting to rent it out, and not just end up with a family of 5 in a 1-bedroom apartment with 4 dogs, and I wanted to get a realistic rent for a single person, then I brought the price down. So it was like, would something like that like skew the numbers on your site, or is there enough out there where you're actually seeing stuff you feel comfortable reporting that these are the actual numbers being rented out for?
Yeah, we in that specific case, we would actually take the last data point, because we understand the price skimming methodology. Like, a lot of landlords will do that, or even realtors on behalf of their clients. And that's something I forgot to mention, but like, get a ton of realtors who use rentals.ca and post listings directly there. Yeah. And we do carry the MLS feed as well. So like anything on MLS rent pushes through rentals.ca. But you can also just post directly. So that's sometimes landlords trying, realtors, often maybe trying an exclusive listing and trying to get both sides of the deal, right? But yeah, we'll always see that price skimming in the data, and we pull that last rent. That's what we use. Very, very common. Makes a lot of sense, especially if you've got some time between when your tenant moves out to try to get that highest possible rent.
This episode of the Tom Storey Show is brought to you by Realty Ninja. Hey, real estate agents, I bet you didn't get into the real estate industry to try to become a web developer. Realty Ninja will help you build a beautiful website for your business without becoming all techie, because me and Steve are certainly not techie. They'll set up your entire site for you, they'll migrate the content from your current site, and they'll take care of all the back end, switching the domains, all the things that you don't want to do, they'll take care of for you. Their team of in-house designers will make your new site match your current brand and help you stand out from your competitors. Best of all, Realty Ninja offers a free unlimited trial that lets you build out your website, and they do not charge you until you're ready to launch. That's right, they're so confident in their product and that you're gonna love the website that you build with them. They will not charge you until it's ready to launch. They don't even take your credit card details. Listeners of the Tom Storey Show will not only get an unlimited trial before you launch, but if you go to realtyninja.com/Tom, you will get 20% off your first year after you launch. A beautiful, functional, and professional website is absolutely a must in today's real estate landscape, and Realty Ninja delivers. So go to realtyninja.com/Tom for 20% off your first year. That's realtyninja.com/Tom. And now back to the podcast. I was going to ask you, Max, I was looking at numbers for a 2028 completion for a purpose-built rental. I can't really say like where it was or anything, but anyways, they were looking that far out, and the only number that caught my eye that I'm like, I just don't know. Oh, everything looked good, but they had it to a point that even if rents only go up 3% a year from now until 2028, they had studio apartments. I can say kind of where it was in Vancouver, studio apartments renting at $2,800 as their number on the pro forma. And I'm just like, are we going to get to $3,000 for a 450 square foot junior one bedroom? Like, is that possible? I guess it's possible if we follow the trends. It just seems like unbelievable.
I think it's definitely possible unless some sort of trends start to change, like demographic trends or consumer behavior trends or immigration trends. And those are real possibilities. It's hard to speculate though on whether, if those things continue to just trend the way they have been,
right,
then it's likely.
Hey, can you guys see, I'm sure you can you see on your site the people that are coming in searching rentals that are not in Canada?
Yeah, we've got the traffic numbers for them for sure. So we understand the demand changes. One thing that we look at that's like really, really interesting is Google Trends data, which goes beyond our site, but we just keep an eye on it in general. And anybody can do this, right? Like Google Trends is one of my favorite tools. I don't know if you've ever used it, but you can basically just go figure out what the online search traffic history is for any given term. So you could type in like apartments in Canada, you type in apartments in Toronto, type in rental homes Toronto, and see, since I think they go back to 2004, how much demand has changed for people searching for that. And we peaked in 2018 in most of the major cities in Toronto, in Canada, and that's not even like adjusted for population. And if you do that same search and you look at only audiences from outside of the country, so that's like a domestic view. But if you look at, let's say you isolate for India,
sure,
we're seeing a huge decline, just like as of late in the last year or two, in terms of that interest level, which might be a leading indicator, right? Like in terms of potentially one of those trend lines shifting.
Right.
Does immigration stay as strong as it has been? Does Canada stay as desirable as it has been for newcomers? If something like that changes, then that pro forma that you were talking about, maybe that also has to change, right? Because there's a number of fundamental assumptions underlying those numbers.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Like, it's just crazy to think where it could go here moving forward. Let's talk about for a sec a fun issue that everyone loves to talk about is the landlord-tenant board here in Ontario. I know you guys are not directly involved, obviously, but you're in the rental space and you probably hear stories and things. Like, it's just such a mess. The backlog's insane. Renters know they can just wait things out, get 6 more months before they get booted out of there. It's a system that is making investors second guess if they even want to invest in real estate. We could talk all day of if investors are a good thing or a bad thing, if they bring supply or just take away housing from first-time home buyers. But landlord-tenant is just like, how did it get? Do you have any insight on like how did it get this bad? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but it got super backlogged, like beyond reasonable during the pandemic, and they just have not recovered from that backlog. That's my understanding of it. But it's really bad. It's bad to the point where I even think it's impacting rents. Like, it would go back to that discussion where anecdotally, I know many small landlords, and I've talked to many small landlords who have sacrificed upside on rent to just get a larger pool of applicants so that they can choose a more quality applicant. Kind of like you were just talking about with your basement apartment, right? Like, and perhaps they would have been fine with whoever they got, but like it's becoming fundamentally more important to ensure that you've got a great tenant than to maximize rents, because the potential downside is insane now. Like, it could be a year's worth of rents and mortgage payments. We all know what's going on there. So yeah,
because we see it all the time where our team has a rental division. Will help tenants and landlords if they want help as well. And sometimes the feedback we get from the tenants is like, why are they asking for so much? I don't feel comfortable showing them this or this. And we all know like credit and employment, and you can show bank statements and things like that. But personal references, you can put your friend that will say anything. So I don't even know if that's super helpful. Like, is there anything that you guys, I don't know. I know, again, you don't do the leasing, but on the vetting side of tenants, I know Steve's got his 18-point plan.
There's actually, I don't know if you guys do this or not, because again, I'm not involved in rentals except for the personal side of things for my own properties. But I just actually got a message from my credit check company that says they're going out of business, because there's all these new fees apparently that have been put on by the credit bureau within the last few months, or this year, I guess, where the business model is no longer sustainable. I guess they weren't into increasing prices, I guess, I don't know. But that is such a pain point for landlords to try and vet these folks, where like, I don't know where I'm going to go now, because I had this one company that I used. They were great. They were online, based out of Ontario, and I used them to vet every single tenant. They had a membership fee. It was a beautiful system, but now they're gone. Do you have a solution for me?
Got a solution for you.
I think Max might have bought them, Steve.
Oh, okay.
Not yet. I don't know who you're talking about, but we have a few different tenant screening solutions. So one is built into Rent Faster, has a built-in one that's really meant for smaller landlords. You can run credit checks and ID checks as well, which is really important with the amount of fraud going on. We're actually porting that functionality over to Rentals.ca right now, but it exists within Rent Faster, and you don't have to necessarily list through Rent Faster to use it. And then we do have a more enterprise-grade tenant screening solution via Building Stack, which is a software brand that we own. Really meant for more of an enterprise property manager, but works well. Works well for small landlords and realtors as well. Pretty low cost. Like, it's easy for anybody to get that rolling. but yeah, what we've run a couple surveys, like landlord side surveys recently, where we ask people to rank their challenges from top to bottom in terms of, you know, the renting process, and time again, it is always tenant screening. Like, and that just comes back to the fear of what happens if you get a bad tenant. And so, yeah, like we're really investing in that area right now, really trying to pump some dollars into that and smooth out our solutions.
Well, there is some opportunity there, because my folks are no longer in business, and it was a great system. It was just simply, you know, you upload the application with all the information they needed. They gave you a report on, hey, where their credit's at, and they actually gave you a report on the likelihood of the data they have of the tenant paying rent on time, and they actually gave you like a score. It was super cool, and it hasn't gone bad on me yet. They've been able to identify tenants that, you know, aren't so great, and even ones I've taken, and the ones they gave the lowest score to are the tenants that I've had over the years that have had the worst track record. So it was pretty cool. But that is such a pain point, because let me tell you, if you just want to do it on a handshake, you can rent out your place for a lot of money, and you will pay for it 10 times over in headaches.
Mm-hmm. Our current government has decided that renters need to be protected. And as the CEO of likely the biggest rental portal in the country, any thoughts on the Renters Bill of Rights, how this is going to work, how it plays out? You know, I'm sure that's come up in meetings with you guys.
Yeah, I'm not sure that anything that was put forth in the Renters Bill of Rights is a truly impactful solution. Even probably the biggest announcement from it was that they want to legislate in somehow, and they haven't stated how, that your rent payments would count towards your credit, so that when you do go to become a homeowner, hopefully one day, that you've got this record in place that's going to help you. And practically speaking, when you talk to people in the mortgage industry, that doesn't really play a big factor. Like, you can build credit in other ways anyways. They can take that into account already anyways. And then, like, how unbelievably complicated will it be to legislate that and control that entire process? Like, administratively, like, very, very difficult. And then there's all sorts of data privacy issues. Well, it works really well when you've got a renter who has paid their rent on time and never missed a payment. But doesn't that go against you pretty poorly if you have missed a payment? So, you know, like, I just don't think that will come to fruition anytime soon. And all the other items were really minor. They aren't actually out there to protect. They're not going to do much, I guess, right, sadly. And it's really just like a lot of like fixed stopgap type small items. Don't see those being the solution.
Seems like they were recycling potentially old ideas and just bringing them up and marketing them slightly different.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible, like, at least, you know, we're going to build 1 billion homes in the next 8 years in Canada. So we know that already, right? A good chunk of them are going to be rentals. Is it possible that we oversupply rentals at some point here? Like, if immigration gets cut in half, let's just say that possibly happens, and we're like, all right, let's go. Purpose-built rentals, government funded, whatever. Is it possible that rental prices could stagnate? Like, we've had times with real estate prices in Toronto where nothing happened for 10 years. Well, it went up and down, but nothing actually happened by the end of it. Is it possible that happens for rentals?
Anything is possible. And I think it's a very nuanced answer, because I think it does come back to mainly demographic changes and population changes in certain areas. I think as a whole in Canada, it's probably not possible to oversupply rentals based on our current trajectory of construction as a whole in Canada. But I think it is possible that if trends shift, population trends shift, net provincial migration trends continue to shift, that there will be pockets of the country where we do absolutely potentially oversupply rentals. And that really, I guess, comes back to the belief of where we think is going to be a popular place to live at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So I definitely think it's possible. Like, it could be Toronto, it could be Vancouver, or it might not be. Like, and I'm not in the business of guessing. I have my own personal opinions of what might happen, but it's really tough to know, right?
And I guess it's fair to say, and I'm not going to make any assumptions, but the CEO of Rentals.ca probably owns their own house, right? So we're looking at, like, I'm not, I was going to bring it up at some point, but I had to. But Steve told me not to bring it up. I'm like, you got to bring it up. It's too good.
Oh, fine.
Right?
And to your point, Steve, earlier, like, I don't disagree. Like, home ownership is, in my opinion, a fundamentally very important thing in this country. Like, I'm not like everyone should just rent. Like, that's not the point. The reality is a lot of people in this country have to rent, at least 40%. Right? Like, so we're there to provide that service, but I also believe in home ownership. It's critical.
Gotcha. Let's talk about rent control. We have opinions on rent control. I'd be curious what your thoughts are on your side of this industry. Has rent control helped? Has it made things worse? Should we just scrap it all together? Is having the specific date that used to be like 91, now it's November 15th, 2018, does that just make it more confusing? I'm asking you lots of questions, but general rent control thoughts.
Do you need insurance? The answer to that question is obviously yes, of course you do. Whether you are a tenant, landlord, or homeowner, you need to insure your property and belongings. And when I insure my investment property, personally, I choose Square One. Square One is affordable online insurance for everyone. If you apply for your Square One insurance policy using the link in the description of the show notes, listeners of the Tom Storey Show can receive $20 off right now, simply by going to squareone.ca/the Tom Storey Show. Square One is no joke. I personally use Square One for my landlord policy on my investment condo. I picked Square One because they were easier to work with than other insurance companies. And when I had an issue with my previous policy coverage in relation to my Strata's coverage, Square One was the insurance company that came up with a solution for my insurance problem at an affordable rate. Online quotes take less than 5 minutes with Square One. Get your home insurance quote today at squareone.ca/the Tom Storey Show and save $20.
It's a really difficult subject, and I'm very empathetic towards renters, especially new renters who walk into today's rental rates, asking rates, and are not protected in any way. But overall, and I just sort of take the economist side on this, like, rent control has been very, very bad. One of the major reasons why we're in this situation in Ontario and British Columbia, where your two largest cities have the highest rents in the country, it is not coincidental that both of those are rent-controlled provinces, and the impact over the long haul on supply has been extremely evident. And there have been studies done in the US, studies done in other areas of the world that have time and time again shown that over a long horizon, rent control hurts the very people that it is meant to protect, which is renters. In the short term, and this is why I'm quite empathetic towards it, it's obviously good for renters, right? Over a 2 or 3 year arc, like, that's excellent for renters. But the problem is, if we're trying to make decisions to actually fix the housing problem here in Canada, we need to make 10-year decisions.
Yeah.
Even further.
If it's good, though, if it's good in the short term, why is it not good in the long term?
Well, it's good in the short term only for the purpose of protecting renters who have a place under lease, right now, because it means that those renters cannot face above guideline increases to their rent, which have been, especially in the last few years, historically lower than inflation. So like above guideline rent increase, guideline from Ontario has been like 2%, or around 2% for the last few years, where inflation's been 10%, as we knew, for a couple of years. And so comparatively to all the other expenses in their life, rent has actually stayed low. And so to offer that possibility to more renters who are maybe not in a rent controlled situation now obviously has its benefits in the short term. In the long term, what it ends up doing is it makes the investment into the entire housing sector and the investment into rental housing far less attractive, because as you are a developer and you can allocate capital really anywhere, you don't even have to allocate it to housing at all, let alone rental. Like you could go and invest in tech, you can go and invest in global markets. Like you have money, what do you want to do with it? If all of a sudden you put a cap on the upside of a certain product, that makes that segment of investment far less attractive, and it means that there will be less built. And that's what happened. We put rent control in place, and then rental buildings stopped being built in Ontario, and now we're paying for it several decades later. And and that's why over the long haul, in a capitalist society, which I believe we mostly are, that is the unfortunate truth behind rent control, and the lack of supply has driven pricing through the roof for renters.
I've always thought that rent control is great if you're currently living in a rental unit. You're going to stay there for the next 15 years and you have no interest of moving. You're never going to move, and you're never interested in buying a property. Otherwise, it hurts. And I remember back to 2017, long before things even went kind of the craziest that they got, when we had the Fair Housing Act here in Ontario, when the Liberals were in provincially, and one of the things was rent control, and they brought it in. And I remember at that time, we were actually starting to see a whole bunch of purpose-built rentals maybe coming back to the city. This was before the boom more recently. They all got canceled or turned into condos. And it's like, okay, so the thing you did for a political reason has now stopped more supply from coming to the market, or at least the type of supply that we so desperately needed at that time. So, I mean, I can understand why people argue the other side, but I you just look at the numbers. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked.
I'm seeing it too. So I just had sold a tenanted property a while back, and for that particular property, the tenant was getting a deal. They had been there for many years, and it was already a deal, right? It was like, I'm going to say, let's say it was $1,800 to rent the property per month. And then when we went to sell the property, well, if you want to stay, no investor is going to take on $1,800, because real market value is probably $4,200 per month for that property. So then they worked out an agreement that the tenant said, well, listen, I could, if I could stay, I could go up to $3,200 a month. Well, guess what? It's still not enough. So it ended up selling for less to an owner-occupier. So good for housing prices, right? If it could have gone to an investor, it probably would have sold for more, but it couldn't because of the rent control. So the owner-occupier got it for less. But now that tenant has to vacate in 60 days. And they are, at best, for that $3,200 that they can afford, they're going to go down to a much, much smaller style of home, of which that's where I see the damage. So the damage is artificially keeping you low, gives you an unrealistic expectation of where rents should be for the future. And then because you've got such a good deal, let's say $1,000, $2,000 off for the last 10 years you've been in the property, what's 20 grand a year, right? What's 10 grand a year? It's nothing. And then when those folks actually do dive into the new rental pool, which is inevitable, they're going to get evicted at some point. They're not going to stay there till they pass away. At some point, that property will sell. They just get shocked. They get absolutely shocked. And I don't think that's good for anybody.
There's a lot of consequences to rent control, and any form of government intervention or regulation typically has a lot of consequences. That is one of them, right? Like misaligned expectations and like pricing shock and those sorts of things. I think there's two others that we see just a ton of, especially in Ontario. One is stagnancy. So in markets where there's no rent control, you get an normal amount of turnover in rental buildings. You get situations where you have 25 to 30% turnover. That's sort of the normal. So if you have a 100-unit building, what that means is 25 to 30 people will move out, during the course of a year. That's pretty normal. Like in the US, in non-rent controlled markets, in Alberta, that's pretty normal, non-rent controlled market. Right now, the CMHC data is showing that we are down to 10% turnover in Ontario, which is crazy. Like that's historically low. And that's also because we've gone through a period of inflation where we have a higher inflation than they allowed for rent guideline increases. And so people look at their rent as like necessary to continue to live their life. So stagnancy is one of the consequences. And the other major consequence is this, like, as you kind of described it, like it drives a wedge between landlords and tenants. So landlords and tenants traditionally are supposed to be this customer service, like any business, it should be like a customer service business. As a landlord, you should be trying to retain your customer. You should be nice to them. They're paying you money. But what rent control has created is a situation where sometimes landlords, and not all landlords are bad actors, but sometimes landlords you'll see have rent evictions, or they're taking over the property for their own personal use, and it's not necessarily the case. And this is simply because, or they'll do the opposite, which is they'll just treat tenants poorly until they move. They won't fix anything. They won't respond. And then, like that's just not normal in a customer service relationship. And it tends to rear its ugly head in our space more. And I think that's partly at the fault of that policy, right? So, I see multiple consequences to it that most of them are not positive, especially over the long haul. But I will reiterate that I have a lot of empathy for renters right now, because it is just a huge percentage of somebody's income to just get a basic rental right now. And that's really tough.
So why don't we talk about where this is going next? Because Steve, you mentioned that it's inevitable that if someone rents for a long time, eventually the place is going to get sold. Well, what won't get sold is an old apartment building. Well, maybe it will get sold now for it to be redeveloped. But these new purpose-built rentals, it didn't start that great. These new purpose-built rentals probably are not going to be sold. Okay, they're all owned by big corporations. There is a boom of purpose-built rentals coming to this country fast. There's a ton in Toronto. Certainly the rents are not affordable. No, not that they're not affordable, but they're not affordable rents. What's your thoughts on purpose-built rentals? Is this the solution that we needed?
Well, any supply is important, whether it's condos, and right now that's a major concern because a lot of condos are not being built.
It'll be an issue in a few years.
Pre-sale value, yeah, exactly. So our take is that any supply is very helpful. The type of supply that's going on in purpose-built rentals is mainly at the higher end of the market. Like, we're not seeing a lot of what happened in the 70s and 80s when a lot of these apartment buildings got built, which is just basic apartments, not a lot of amenities, and kind of working class housing, right? And we're seeing really high end, I would even say beyond your typical condo quality type rent.
Probably better actually. Yeah,
because they're packaging in like unbelievable gyms and unbelievable amenities that you're essentially renting, right? Like and value adding. And the reason for this isn't necessarily because that's the the highest consumer demand. It's actually in the working class housing, but it's because those are the only types of projects that pencil. Those are the only types of projects that make sense to squeeze out the highest possible per square foot rent is the only way to make these projects make sense. And they barely make sense. They're like on the margins already, right? So a lot of them are getting paused. So if anybody's wondering, okay, well, why are all these new builds like super, super luxury? Because they wouldn't exist if they aren't, and that's the unfortunate reality. And that's why we're seeing this boom in that area.
It seems like they're basically like, obviously they're for people that move to a city that are maybe younger, not ready to get into the market, single, things like that. But I'm also noticing like, it's like almost like they're going after downsizers too. It's like sell your big house, cash out, instead of going to buy another condo in an older building, just come rent here. It's great. So there's this mix. Like someone that I work with lived in one of these buildings for a few years, and she said like the experience was great and it was all different types of people. But then what happened is her rent got not just jacked, but like, because they're not under rent control. Like twice in a row, it got to the point she's like, screw this, I'm going to go find something else, and rented a house in the area for less than what she was paying for a smaller apartment. But I guess like these big corporations not that they don't care, but they care less than a mom and pop landlord potentially about the person that's going to be there, because they know they can just turn it over. Somebody else will show up.
So your rental restrictions in Ontario, your rental increase, rent control, is that on houses too built in that time fair? Like, is it the construction of the property, or is it
Correct.
Just stratified, or
Construction of the property?
If you are a real estate agent in Ontario, you know that it's your obligation to explain RECO's information guide to your clients. And now TRESAvideo.ca can help make that explanation easier and increase your trust and transparency all at the same time. Tom's team has been using the video that they got from TRESAvideo.ca for a few months now, and both his agents and clients love it. And now exclusively for the month of June, you can use code JUNE50 for $50 off your purchase. So go to TRESAvideo.ca and enter code JUNE50 for a limited time.
So even detached. Okay.
Anything new built after November 15th, 2018 is currently, as it stands, not under rent control. And we have investor buyers coming to us all the time saying like, what do I focus on here? And I'm like, well, if I were you, I'd probably buy in a building built after that time frame. If you're an investor, like, why would you lock yourself up in an older building? Because you get higher rents in the newer buildings. They do pretty well, and you're not being capped at the rent increases. And flip it. If we're helping a tenant, it's like, hey, do not rent in these newer buildings. Yeah. Go for the older ones because you're more protected. And if they're renting for a year or two, that's what Max is saying. Like that's good for them to rent for a year or two, figure out their finances, then they get into the housing market they purchase. That's great that over that small period of time, they're protected, right? So it's like...
Yeah. And we used to have that option too here, right? Because we have totally different rental rules. Like when we used to have strata rental restrictions where the owners could say no rentals or a limited amount of rentals or whatever, that actually kept the house prices down, and it actually kept more affordable units for end users. So if anything, the removal in the name of wanting affordable rentals, the removal of rent restrictions has increased prices for homeowners.
Max, when BC took away all those restrictions, did you guys see an influx of new rental listings? Because they took away all the or age restrictions are still there, Steve, or no?
Age restrictions have been limited,
okay,
but rental restrictions were completely removed last year, whenever it was.
Or what about like when Airbnb, Toronto, Vancouver essentially made it impossible to Airbnb your property? Did you guys see all now long-term rentals just flooded?
We did. We also ran ad campaigns for our network.
Smart.
At the same time, and it didn't just happen in British Columbia. It happened in Halifax at the same time. So some at the municipal level, some at the provincial level, where there were these Airbnb bans. And I actually expect that once one province or municipality does something, and a couple months go by or a year goes by, and everything hasn't lit on fire, like other policymakers in other jurisdictions start to look at those types of decisions. So I expect that will continue. We saw significant influx from both markets when basically Airbnb got banned, right? Like it became impractical to actually try an Airbnb. And so you own this investment property, you basically have two options, sell it or long-term rental.
Yeah, basically. I don't know. There's just, I think Alberta, I'm giving you guys a heads up. You're about to get all the things that Ontario and BC has been dealing with for the last 15 years because people are now starting to complain about rental prices. They just had a big decision a few weeks ago about zoning for single family that people are like mad about. It's interesting seeing now them going through all the things that we've dealt with as well. Steve?
It is super interesting because you now have an influx of property owners that are coming from a different mindset where they want things to be fair. So you're going to the place in Alberta and Saskatchewan and all these places where they have no restrictions or very few restrictions. And now you're going to have a population who wants those restrictions because they had them all in the last place, but they made that place worse to live. And they're all going to go there. So you're going to start seeing...
We're just jumping around the country, ruining everything.
Yeah. Totally. All the people from Toronto and Vancouver, they're going to now go, well, we need rent control over here too. No, rent control's what fucked it up over there, guys.
Right.
Like you guys don't realize you moved to the place where we didn't have those things and that's why it was better, but now you want those things there. Like, just get out of here. Drive me crazy.
It only takes the first like political candidate of a major party to pander to that short-term desire, and I really emphasize the short-term desire, and not think about solving the long-term problem. So you're exactly right. In Alberta, there's a lot more pressure now in the housing market, and this is now probably the top discussion point amongst constituents and party leaders. And so who's going to be the first to call for rent control and run on it? And then they're going to, mess it all up. What they had, they'll mess it all up. And it's not just Canada. We saw the same demographic change in the U.S. Where people are moving from California to Phoenix and Austin, Texas, Arizona, and, Texas are unbelievably kind of, call it landlord-friendly states. And it's also just those people who are moving have different political beliefs as well. So they're bringing their political beliefs and increasing the voter base of people with those political beliefs. And
but they're not smart enough to realize those political beliefs are what caused them to leave the place that they left. So pretty simple.
I don't blame the people, though. I don't blame the people. I blame the short-term pandering of often policymakers and politicians who know better. They have the people around them, that the economists around them, and the analysts around them that for sure know the data and have told them rent control will create a housing crisis in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years. And they do it anyways, right? And it's not the people. I get the people are frustrated and super, super depressed about rental prices. It's hard to blame them.
When I drive around downtown, I am noticing that traffic is the worst it's ever been again. But what I'm also noticing, and I see this from my friend group, is that people are still not going into the office every single day. The flex seems to be here to stay. I know a lot of people sign huge leases, huge commercial leases, and they're half empty. So at some point, are we looking at this and actually saying, okay, we got a lot of commercial real estate that's sitting vacant in Toronto or other big markets. I know it's not going to be cheap to convert, but is that conversation now really starting where like this is an option that we could look at seriously to bring more inventory?
Yeah, this is a pretty trendy topic, which is commercial, mainly office space, to residential conversions across North America. You said it's not going to be cheap to convert. It could be really, really expensive to not convert. And what I mean by that is Toronto, as an example, the largest source of revenue for the city of Toronto is commercial property taxes. And Toronto office vacancy rates have been on the rise now since the pandemic, and they don't seem to be slowing down. And I think they're probably just going to continue to tick upwards, especially with just the economic pressures that a lot of businesses are facing. They're looking to cut OpEx and office space right at the top. So that's my opinion, which is that not converting a portion of the stock or having a plan in place, municipalities having a plan in place to convert a portion of your stock and city planning around that could be really, really bad. It will be property owners themselves who will have to pick up the tab and make up the difference for the property tax base in residential in Toronto. And that concerns me a lot as a homeowner here and as a resident here. We've seen really innovative programs like in Calgary, where the city has recognized that they had a lot of vacant office space in the downtown core. They set a target and put grants in place to help those landlords convert to often lofts, residential, rental, and it's been tremendously successful. They're actually re-upping. They've gone through the first phase of it. Toronto is so backwards. I can't even begin to tell you how backwards they are. Not only if you are a landlord, can you not take your vacant office space and convert it to residential right now. You can't just go and do that. If you do, there is a rule in place. I think it's a bylaw in place that for every square foot of office space you eliminate in the city, you have to replace. So it's that's why you won't see a single project. There's not one office to residential conversion going on right now, because if you have to replace, that doesn't pencil.
Right.
So
you know what we're going to do? We're going to add a third land transfer tax. Okay. We need a third one in Toronto. Two's not good enough.
I just can't.
Yeah, I know.
I don't do anything commercial at all, but my goodness, you think real estate prices for residential are unhinged? Like, I remember, so I've looked, those commercial units, it's like an office in the front, a little showroom, and then a warehouse at the back, a mezzanine. I was looking at those 8 years ago. I was like, this would be a really cool spot to put my office, right? Have my own stuff, all my storage in the back for signs and all, they were like $380,000. And then you had to build them out. And I was like, oh, okay. A bad one now in a neighborhood you don't want to be in is $1.2 million. And the ones I was looking at before are like $2 million. And the ones I just saw one sell. The reason this is so front of mind, I just saw one sell in our office, $4.5 million. Now it was a little bigger one. It was a nicer area, newer building, but like $4.5 million. If you're buying a bay to run your business out of and you're paying $4.5 million, like, what is the rent on that if you're going to lease it out? Or if you're the owner that bought it, what type of business do you have to run? And that's not at 4%, 5% mortgages, right? That's not at residential rate mortgages.
That's commercial mortgages. Yeah.
It's so crazy. It's absolutely nuts. And that's now what is going vacant, though, is the office space. So those are all like spaces where you can do a business out of, where you actually need product, or maybe you're running a service or something. Office space seems to be the other side, but it's not cheap. I was looking at a different office space just for lease, and it just didn't make sense. It makes zero sense to run my own office. It's insane.
I don't think we've hit that point where like commercial office assets have adjusted yet to potentially the new reality. I don't know if it will continue. Like, I'm not trying to predict the future, but if it does continue, then those assets will be worth less as commercial assets than they would be potentially as residential assets if they could be converted. So
Calgary's a little different, though, because if you're coming from Vancouver and Toronto and you haven't spent time in Calgary, you don't realize that traditionally Calgary has had no residential in their downtown core. Like, they are a bedroom city, right? Bedroom community. Everyone at the end of the day leaves. Like, if you want to go hang out at a pub after work in Calgary. It's like, it's not a thing. Right. And
it's
now
changing. That's changing.
That's changing.
Yeah.
It's changing for sure.
Yeah.
But it's not like Vancouver or Toronto where you were like, okay, let's go down for the game and then we're going to go to the bar. Like there was no activity other than the hockey games. There was no activity in the downtown core. I remember going there for a conference, I want to say in 2012. And I was like, this place is a ghost town at night. Absolute ghost town. Because everybody drives 35 minutes outside of the city, goes to their, at that time, $200,000 detached home. And I don't know, plays hockey in their backyard because it's minus 35 degrees.
All right, let's give Calgary a break for a second. Max, here's what I'm trying to figure out. So we've had the chief economist of BMO on the show. We had Doug Porter on. I asked him about rental prices moving forward. It was not rosy for him. He's like, I think it gets worse. Like if all this stays the same, it gets worse. If what we've learned today is the city of Toronto is basically making it impossible to convert the commercial space, okay? What I also can tell you from my side of the industry is that pre-con projects are not selling right now. Developers are not launching. They are not selling. The numbers do not make sense for the investor, for the developer, anything. And that won't be an issue for the next 2 years. But in 3, 4, 5 years, it's going to be an issue if they don't come to the market. And then we're looking at, okay, so are we is purpose-built rental the only, that's all we got? What else are we going to do? Is there anything else we can do? I guess people are building laneway suites and things like that, but you need a chunk of cash to get that off the ground. And I don't know.
Yep. Purpose-built rentals is definitely going to make up the majority of the new housing stock, especially in the GTA, because especially a couple of years out with these condos not being built. And if you're inferring like where are rents going, we're in a little bit of a lull right now, as I mentioned, in Toronto, Vancouver. I don't expect that that's going to last very long,
right?
Because at the end of the day, supply demand is going to come back and just kind of kick us in the ass again. We might have this sort of interprovincial migration. We might have some population shifting based on the millennial population being able to kind of work remotely. Once that balances out, once Calgary becomes not such an affordable destination anymore, there'll be a next version of Calgary. Actually, that's sort of Edmonton, to be honest. Edmonton's really popping as well.
It's Steve's favorite city in Canada.
Yeah, but slowly things balance out. And then at the end of the day, you still have a complete disaster when it comes to supply and demand. Just a disaster. I can't think of a better word. And that will just hit all cities probably more equally. Like I don't think it'll be like Toronto going up 25%,
right? And
Edmonton, Calgary going up 0. But I think it'll just more equally rise over time. But the whole country, like rents are going to go up. There's just no way.
We looked at when the pandemic happened, where all the markets outside Toronto or outside Vancouver, they went up crazy in value, right? And we called it the great equalizer. Like the pandemic just raised prices everywhere. I think we didn't really notice what was happening because that was happening just outside the major cities. The great equalizer is coming for all of Canada, right? It's now slowly, but it might be a 10, 15-year thing where the people with money here moved here and then they brought up the prices there. And I don't know.
Could you imagine if money wasn't a factor, though? If money wasn't a factor and all the people that wanted to live in Toronto and wanted to live in Vancouver lived there, can you imagine how expensive it would be and how cheap everywhere else would be? Because everybody still wants to be in those areas.
If money wasn't a factor, you think people would only live in Toronto or Vancouver?
Yeah. 100%.
Maybe you're right.
Oh, yeah. Like, because
if like you were guaranteed to get what you wanted and you could choose where you lived and money didn't matter, you'd pick one of those two.
Yeah, like if you take out the like, oh, I want to go live in the bush or have a view of the ocean or whatever, but like if you take all that out and if you're like, hey, if people could just afford the rents and felt like it was good, no matter what the rent was, Vancouver and Toronto would be sky high compared to the rest of the country. And it's the evening out that's happening right now. The pressure on Calgary is because of Toronto and Vancouver. The pressure on, I don't know where else anybody's going to go, Nova Scotia, is because of the pressure in Toronto.
Max, your last report had like, I think Halifax was crazy up in rent. Winnipeg was crazy up in rent. Saskatchewan. Like it's all the places that we would think are, oh, that's the cheap markets. Well, the cheap markets are rising.
They're rising, but they're still the cheap markets. And that's why they're still rising, right? That's the balancing that's happening. Like, it's still percentage-wise, they have the highest increases right now, dramatic increases, and it's concerning to see. But the reason it's still occurring is because it's still way more affordable than Toronto or Vancouver. So, Steve, to your point, I kind of agree. If you isolated for just urbanites, right? Urbanites, like, so take away people who want to own a ranch somewhere up in Caledon or something. But urbanites, you know, they tended to put Toronto and Vancouver probably at the top of their list. That being said, as people move to these other areas, those cities will respond. They will urbanize. They will become more of a destination themselves. As we just talked about with Calgary, where we're seeing this shift in the downtown core. And I hang out in Calgary all the time. I think it's actually somewhat happening. They've got a couple of really nice stretches and really good restaurants, and we're seeing that shift. And so maybe Toronto and Vancouver, that will also balance out, I guess, is my point.
Well, that was fun, man. Thank you for joining the show today. I think we covered a lot in the last hour. What I learned is rent control doesn't work. We're not quite sure about housing prices moving forward. Alberta, get ready because your regulations are coming. For people listening or watching that are interested in rentals all across Canada, is rentals.ca just the main place you tell them to go, or does it depend on region?
Rentals.ca, all the rental stock is there. If you're in Alberta specifically, Rent Faster is just a gem. Everybody in Alberta knows it and absolutely crushes there. So and the rent report at rentals.ca.
That's what I was gonna say. So can they sign up for a newsletter for the rent report, or it just shows up on rentals.ca every month?
Yeah, if you go to the rent report, it's right on the homepage basically of rentals.ca. You can sign up, you can throw your email in there, and you'll never miss one. Yeah.
Okay, send me over that email list, okay? I can start prospecting. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week. Bye. All right, one sec.